Welcome to the stage, optimist, author, and founder of The Curve, Simon Sinek.
Yes. Thank you very much. So obviously you're all here for Scott Galloway. Scott is one of those people who pushes you to see the world differently. It's one of the reasons I love him and love his work. He also puts himself out there in a way that I think very, very few others can or want to. He's so vulnerable and shares with us the struggles that he's going through that we can relate to. But more important, his views on the world, his perspective on how it works are different than everybody else, which is why we have to listen to Scott. He doesn't always get his predictions right, but we have to listen. Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Galloway.
Thank you. My name's Scott Galloway. I teach at NYU. I have 147 slides and 2,400 seconds, so let's light this candle. So in the spirit of transparency, I don't know Simon that well. I don't like him very much, but it's a power move to have him introduce me. Okay, so got home pretty late last night and decided to reorient the slides. I fiddled with the slides up until the time I present them. And I thought, given that we're on a cruise ship, and I met a lot of people last night who are in the business of travel, that we would try and talk about travel. I'll make some predictions around tech. It's kind of a around the world tour. It's basically whatever I just wanted to talk about tonight. And then hopefully we'll leave some time for my favorite part, Q&A. We have a pretty intimate crowd here tonight, so I'm going to try and leave some time for Q&A. Okay, we're going to talk about the economy, travel, transportation, what else, AI, because we didn't get enough of that today, income inequality. I'm worried about the shit I've created after I've made tens of millions of dollars. But I'm Dr. Frankenstein, and I think Frank might have some violent tendencies. I'm concerned. Yeah, fuck you, figure out what we do. I'm going to talk about loneliness. And then I'm going to try and wrap up with, quote unquote, some perspective. So if you weren't reading every day that we were about to have a recession, where would the evidence of any recession be? I think that inflation is going to come down as quickly as it went up. AI, the writer's strike, which will end in tears for the writers. For the first time, people are not as confident negotiating pet bereavement leave in the growth economy. I think you're about to see wage pressure come way down, and you're about to see inflation come way down, back to historic or more normal levels. And I'm not sure, I studied economics, but I don't consider myself an economist, but I don't see any signs of a recession. As I said, inflation is coming way down. Unemployment is at historic lows. Now, some people would argue, well, there's discouraged workers, you have the wrong denominator here, but we essentially have historically low unemployment, retail sales are strong. We've ripped through about $4 of the $5 trillion we handed out during the pandemic, and we're ripping through another $100 billion a month, so there is some credence to the argument, I'm supposed to stand over here, that in about 10 months, people are gonna run out of money. But right now, it doesn't appear, unless you were looking at the media, that you'd see any real signals that we're going into a recession. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see people talk about earnings calls or in earnings calls use the term soft landing as opposed to recession. They're even starting to soften their tone. There's an effect that when you worry about something, or the moment you really begin to start worrying about something, the odds of it happening go way down, right? It's the shit you don't see coming that gets you. None of us really saw the pandemic coming. Remember Greek sovereign debt that was supposedly going to collapse and take down all of Europe, or that all elevators were going to stop working New Year's 2000? It's a general survival instinct that if you worry about something long enough, you unconsciously prepare for it and you avoid it. So we have been talking so much about the recession that I wonder if we're probably it's not going to register. Where we are seeing a recession is what I call the Patagonia vest recession. I have two entries. I'm credited with two entries in the Urban Dictionary. The first is Yoga Babble, which is how I describe the WeWork prospectus. And then I just got my second one, and that is the Patagonia vest recession. And that is the growth economy has had so many calories stuffed down its esophagus that it's built up fatty deposits everywhere. And if you understand balance sheet economics, essentially, if you have gross margins of 20%, which is great gross margins, or operating margins, excuse me, of 20%, you can either add $5 in new income, of new revenue to your company, or you can cut $1 of expenses, and you have the same net effect on shareholder value. So the most actionable or significant on-the-ground impact or strategy of 2023 isn't AI, it isn't supply chain, it's everybody in every boardroom has seen what Elon Musk has done. Specifically, he's fired 80% of his staff. He's taken the staff down from 7,500 people to 1,800, and he's going to 1,000. And there really isn't, from the consumer end, any discernible impact on the product. Now, he's lost about 80% of his, or 60 to 80% of his advertising revenue, but people would argue that's a self-inflicted wound. So in every board, people are asking themselves, how do we have the great taste of reduced costs without the calories of losing revenue? So the business strategy circulating the majority of the growth economy is, could we lay off 10, 20, 30% of our employees, but manage to hold on to the majority of our revenues? That is the easiest way to add shareholder value, and the markets like it. Every time a company announces layoffs, the stock goes up. The majority of the people in this room have never really seen that type of economy before. When I graduated from business school, 40% of my class had a job. So in other words, 60%, two-thirds of the class did not have a single job. My kids now, when I say kids, I mean my students, on average have between 3 and 5 job offers out of NYU Stern, average salary $212,000, meaning if someone goes to work for a nonprofit for $100,000, there's somebody who's accepted a job at $330,000 or $350,000. That is much different. That is, no one ever feels overpaid. The majority of us in this room right now are overpaid. Oh, I do have sound. If in the back, if you can hear this video does have sound. This is one of my favorite videos to kind of summarize the growth economy.
20-year-old product manager at Meta. I always journal in the morning. I then do a quick workout routine. I get dressed. I try to look cute every day. Got some food at the office. I make a coffee every single morning. I need that. I did some work on the roof, worked until lunch, and then ate up there. Here's me being cute. I got a snack always. I then shuttled home. The view's
Can you imagine the fight over who would get to fire this person? Out of 300, I have 300 kids in my class. About 30 to 40 of them go to work for Amazon, about 20 Google. Literally, big tech was coming in every year and hoovering up all human capital. It was a fight. Like every manager's job, usually at the end of the year, and I run growth companies, is how do we keep the young people happy, right? It was just a constant question. How do we keep people with us? How do we attract new people? That has flipped. And I love these TikToks now of people getting fired that day. And my first piece of advice, because I don't think many of you have been fired before, I've been fired from every job I've ever had. And it's not about you. It's not a personal, it's not a statement on your character. It's not about the condition of your soul. It's usually about things outside of your control. And I think the tech community and the labor force was lying to you when they said, bring your full self to work. Don't bring your politics to work. No one gives a shit about your politics. Corporations are a platform to build economic security for you and your family. And they might have pretended that they cared, but they don't. And so don't think that when you get fired or laid off, it's an assessment on you. No, it's not. It's about what's happening at the time in the economy, almost always. You got to put these layoffs in context, though. They make for great headlines, right? Huge headlines. Amazon, Meta lays off 8,000 people, front page. But this is how many people they've hired since the beginning of the pandemic. So all these quote-unquote mass firings are just taking them back to employment levels of 12 or 18 months ago. This is still just a fraction of the people, that human capital that they have brought into their organizations in the last 36 months. The layoffs here, despite all the headlines, represent about 1% of non-farm payroll employment. We're obsessed with big tech, but as it relates to the economy in terms of market capitalization, it's big, but as employment, it actually doesn't employ that many people. 2023, the year of experiences. So if you looked at most things, most structural trends, whether it's e-commerce, even teen depression, and you did know the pandemic had happened, and it just maintained its current slope. Teen depression has been going up steadily since the introduction of social on mobile. E-commerce has been growing high single, low double digits per year. They've all kind of returned to where they would have been around the pandemic. The only thing that appears to be the enduring change is work from home. That appears to be very, very sticky. That's kind of the enduring change coming out of COVID, where if someone showed up and said, how is the world different? How do we know something happened here? It would be remote work. And the really disappointing work, that Jean Twenge and Jonathan Haidt just came out with, is that we've been blaming depression of kids on COVID. And the reality is, if you look at the trends of teen depression, what they found is it wasn't COVID, it was social media that was doing it. And some social distancing didn't create depression among teens, social media did. Ton of revenge travel, right? One of the wonderful things about coming out of COVID is people seem to have a renewed sense of what's important, the finite nature of life, and people are going big in terms of travel. Travel sites, traffic up dramatically, a new record for passports that have been issued in the United States. China's returning to the tourism market, so that's new wind in the sails. And people are spending a greater proportion of their disposable income on travel. And then we're seeing huge demand returning. For the most part, the travel industry is taking advantage of this and using COVID as an excuse not to restore previous service levels. I get to stay in very nice places, mostly because someone else is paying, and the way I would describe luxury travel right now is 6-star prices with 4-star service. And as a result, their margins have never been bigger. They're making up for the revenues that they lost through COVID. It's a great time to be in the travel business. Live entertainment is surging. People want to be around each other, which is a wonderful thing. And also people have a renewed sense of the value of time versus money. Okay, so everything in its own way is retail. And I would argue that the worst retail experiences are grocery stores, airports, and gas stations. Tesla didn't disrupt the auto industry, it disrupted the gas station. If you spend 15 minutes a week in a gas station, that's 12 and a half hours a year pulling in, smelling those carcinogens, worrying about getting shot. That is literally the worst retail experience in America. How much would someone have to pay you to get up at 6, get to the gas station at 7 in the morning, fill up, drive around the block, and do that until 7:30 at night? You would probably pay a lot of money to avoid that. In addition, this industry was so disruptible, mostly because of charging stations or mostly because of the gas stations. I think disruption is more a function of how ripe an industry is to be disrupted as opposed to the disrupting technology. It wasn't immediately obvious that Google was going to disrupt the advertising industry, but the advertising industry had basically said, we're going to triple our costs every 10 years, despite the fact that our audiences are shrinking. More expensive for less reach. And it stuck out its chin. Grocery stores and department stores really hadn't changed in about 30 or 40 years, and the fists of stone of Amazon came forward. Ad-supported cable television got worse and worse, but more and more expensive. And so Netflix came in at $12 a month and disrupted that industry. So the question then becomes, what industry is most ripe for disruption? AI is clearly the technology, right? But more important than the technology is what industry has an enormous chin sticking out right now. And I'll come back and try and answer that. Lines, we spent a lot of time in lines. I think that essentially if you want to build a company that's worth over $100 billion, you've got to build a time machine. If you just let your kids watch Netflix and not broadcast television, that kid saves 12 days a year in commercials. All right, Amazon has given you 6 days back out of spending time in department stores and grocery stores. The majority of companies that get past 100 billion have effectively built time machines. Now, I love the company Clear. I'm obsessed with trying to expedite everything in terms of time. You get that way as you get older. And most of these high-end luxury items are pretty much focused on saving time. Peter Drucker, who's sort of my role model, an economist in the 60s, basically said that every major business trend can be predicted by demographics. And if you were to try and find a demographic trend that's going to wag the tail, that it's a good thing to get behind, and I did get behind this in 2010. I started a company doing business intelligence and analytics for luxury brands, because what I saw was that income inequality was about to become income insanity. And history repeats itself. Essentially, you have an economy that starts off as a collective. Everybody wants to help each other. Wealthy people weaponize government, become more productive, leverage technology, and slowly but surely figure out a way to lower their taxes and figure out a way to engage in massive tax avoidance, accrete more and more power, and will wring their hands and be very concerned about what's going on. And the next year, the tax rate goes down. And eventually there's a revolution and it starts all over again. But we're at a point right now where it's literally gone parabolic. And you've seen all this data about the 0.1%. But if I were to say to people constantly come to me and say, what industry would you be in? I'm like, if I were you, just go into any industry serving the 0.1%. Because the amount of disposable income there, it's like that very basic adage that people used to tell young professionals, get as close to the biggest pile of money. Stand as close as you can to the biggest pile of money and everything will work out. And that pile of money is increasingly accreting to fewer and fewer people. So social clubs, the 1% is now sequestering from everybody else, right? We allow visitors in based on being super interesting or super hot as tourists. We give them a day pass. But mostly we've decided we no longer want to hang out with the other 99%, even when we're socializing. Anyone done one of these private tours at Disney? Disney just announced pretty terrible earnings, but they were saved by one thing, the parks. What they didn't publish was the thing driving a ton of incremental spend there is these private VIP tours, where you pay somewhere between, I think, $700 and $900 an hour, a minimum of 5 hours. So for about $5 to $7 grand, you and 5 friends get to cut the line. I did this for the first time last year. And it's physically uncomfortable when you get to the Avatar ride, and they could hand out an iPad when you get in the line. And you could watch Avatar before you actually get on the ride. The wait time is 3 hours if you only paid $160. But if you paid $7,000, you and your kids get to cut the line. It's about 3 minutes, and they give you a hand signal in case you want to go on a second or a third time. And this is the fastest growing part of the parks business. Think about the profits there. A very high EQ, really nice, young man from Kansas shows you around, takes you in a golf cart behind the bowels of the 3 parks so you can go on the 2 or 3 best rides at each of the 3 parks. It's getting worse. And most of you have probably seen this on TikTok. But this is socialism, right? You start off thinking everyone should be equal. It doesn't work, right? People engage in their own self-interest. That's what capitalism is. It taps into one of the most powerful motivators, and that is our own self-interest. What we want, most people agree that the most productive, hardest working people should make more money. And then it's just gone absolutely insane. People really don't recognize just how insane it's gotten. And by the way, wealthy people usually don't talk about money because they see it as uncouth, which is really nothing but an attempt to keep poor people down by ensuring they don't know how much money they actually are making and have relative to them. So they've created this social dogma around talking about money. I think everyone should talk about how much money they make. I think it's healthy because you're going to find out just how outrageous it is about how some people at a certain level in your company or in society, how much money they're making. So for every $100 created in the past 10 years, $54 went to the top 1%. That's globally. It's actually much worse than that in G7 nations and even much worse in the US. 70 cents of it went to the bottom half. So of $100 in incremental value created over the last 10 years, 70 cents of it went to the bottom half. It used to take 26 billionaires to equal the bottom half of America. Now it takes, it used to take 380 billionaires. Now it takes 26. By the end of next year, there's probably going to be 3 people in the United States that are worth more than the bottom half of America. That's the bad news. The good news is that income inequality is usually self-correcting. More bad news is the means of self-correction are usually war, famine, or revolution. Don't you find it unusual that all of these rich people have their go bags in their bunkers in New Zealand or in Sonoma? I find it so nihilistic and disappointing that the wealthiest, most resourced, and arguably the most intelligent among us decide to devote their resources to colonizing other planets or taking us into another universe, as opposed to just trying to make this place a little bit more fucking habitable. This is the wealthy weaponizing government. These are tax rates. The greatest innovation in history wasn't the iPhone, wasn't chips, it was the middle class. And that is, we had 7 million men coming back from war, and we decided to give them money to buy houses and give them jobs, $500 billion infrastructure act, and that made them more attractive to potential mates, and we had the baby boom. The tax rate on the top 1% in 1945 was 92%, because to sustain the middle class, the greatest innovation in history, took a lot of money. And so we recognized that if we wanted a really progressive tax structure, we would have to tax people at a higher rate. And in the spirit of transparency, just to give you a sense of how ridiculous things have gotten, I start companies. I got very lucky. I sold one of my companies a few years ago. The first $10 million to me, the founder, were tax-free. I've invested in another company. I invested $2.5 million in another company that just got purchased. The first $25 million to me, because of QSB, will be tax-free. Zero tax rate on the first 10 million when you're an entrepreneur, or when you make a large capital investment in a small company. And people will say, well, okay, but you're a productive citizen. You wouldn't start companies unless you had these tax breaks. No entrepreneur knows the tax rates when they start a business. My effective tax rate for the last decade has been 17%. That's been my effective tax rate, and I'm very public about that. And there's another myth, and that is that lower and middle income people are paying all the taxes. Actually, they're not. They pay a lot in consumption and sales tax, but they actually pay very little federal income tax. The people who get most screwed by our tax code are what I refer to as the workhorses. And that is, they make between $150,000 and $1 million a year. And it's all reportable. It's all current income. And they usually, in order to make that kind of money, have to live in an urban center that's usually a blue state. And they're usually paying an effective tax rate of somewhere between 45 and 50%. And they make enough money to live well. No one feels sorry for them. But until they have enough money to start making investments where they register capital gains, they're paying tax rates of 45 or 50%. Now, if they really start to live large and make a lot of money and can afford to put that money into investments, then they make the jump to light speed. And their tax rate, once they get to about the 99th percentile, starts to plummet, right? So we've effectively decided that if you win a gold medal, we're going to take the silver and the bronze and give it to you too. Your tax rate goes parabolic once you go over 6 figures, keeps going higher and higher until about $1 million, and then it absolutely plummets once you get into the top 1%. Luxury is the best business in the world. Wealthiest man in the world didn't invent a search engine or a social media network. He basically creates artificial scarcity, right? He creates desire. Wealthiest man in the world is, of course, Bernard Arnault. And these 3 guys now have wealth greater than the GDP of a bunch of nations. Private flight, private travel, I won't bore you with this. This is an interesting stat, in that private luxury usually gains in popularity before an economic crash because people become self-conscious about their wealth. I'm obsessed with Succession, and this kind of defines sort of quiet luxury. No logos, just very expensive, beautifully crafted things that aren't very flashy. Now you might say, well, where do billionaires come from? The industry that's created the second most billionaires is actually luxury. Tech has created more. This is the best business in the world, and that is creating artificial scarcity. And artificial scarcity is essentially the strategy that, unfortunately, America has adopted. The strongest brands in the world aren't Apple or Hermes or Nike. They're MIT and Stanford and Harvard. And every day, me and my colleagues wake up and we ask ourselves one question: how can I increase my compensation while reducing my accountability? And the way we do that is we've adopted the ultimate strategy. We target the 0.1% and we adopt this rejectionist, exclusionary luxury positioning. And despite the fact we sit on endowments, again, the size of some Latin American GDPs, we don't expand freshman seats. So we can take admissions rates and take them way, way down and turn into a Birkin bag as opposed to public servants. It makes alumni feel good. The value of your degree goes up when it gets harder to get into your institution. The moment you have a house, you start taking an interest in the local review board and basically come up with thoughtful ways to ensure that new housing never gets built. Meaning that housing has accelerated, housing costs in the US have accelerated about the same price as a luxury good. Once I have a tech company and it works, I'm gonna weaponize government to make sure new companies can't get born. Our entire economy has moved to a luxury artificial scarcity economy, where we create artificial scarcity to drive up prices that drive value to the incumbents and the entrenched. This is how I explain it. For most of history, our species hasn't had access to sugary, salty, or fatty foods, so diabetes, right? Our instincts haven't caught up with industrial production. So if you can create something that feels scarce, if you can convince people that a Panerai watch is scarce, right? They artificially choke supply. So if I see one, I think, oh, I gotta buy one because I wanna signal masculinity and strength, I'm dying soon, so I need to signal this type of success, right? And they do a great job of creating art. This is not a difficult thing to produce. It's about $1,500 of movement, plastic, glass, and leather that they sell for about $12,000 by creating this illusion of scarcity. When there's a scarcity of food, a scarcity of mating opportunities, and now a scarcity of luxury items, or scarcity of education at an elite university, you can raise prices faster than inflation and aggregate a great deal of wealth. And this is the only video I could come up with last night to explain it. Three times last night, somebody here, that gets applause? Three times last night, someone offered me mushroom chocolates. And I don't know if that says something about you or something about me. And the third time I said yes, and I just went back to my room and I watched this video about 80 times. It was a pretty nice way to spend the night. I opened the window, kept asking myself, how high am I now? Yeah, it was really nice. So you're out there and thank you. It's the ultimate marketing strategy, create artificial scarcity, right? And luxury has outperformed every other industry. Again, all footing back to a demographic shift, and that is the 0.1% are aggregating more and more wealth. And you may not feel rich. Every person in this room is probably in the top 10% in their G7 economy. And if you make more than $40,000, you're in the top 1% globally in terms of income. Tremendous growth potential. This stat just blew my mind. Hermes now has a larger market capitalization than Nike. Can you believe that? Because most companies, if you can create artificial scarcity, you literally create a cash spigot. And I've worked with all of these companies that I'm talking about. By the way, I'm going to do a ton of name dropping because I'm deeply insecure and desperate for your affirmation. But essentially, Hermes, go into an Hermes store and say, yeah, I'll take that bag. And they're like, oh, sir, that's a 3-year waiting list. This shit is not hard to make. These bags are not hard to make, but they have done a genius job of creating a sense of artificial scarcity. So as a result, if the CFO walks into the COO's office at Hermes and says, I need another literally $1 billion in revenue over the next 3 months, the CEO can do it. No problem. Just produce another, a $15,000 average price point bag. We'll produce another 600,000 bags there, so you're $1 billion. 80 points of gross margin, 800 million in gross margin, 400 million in EBITDA. And the analysts know that. So they can perfectly predict and calibrate. They make their projections, because if they're about to miss their projections, they just turn on the tap. There's very few companies that are able to establish that type of scarcity or create a cash tap, where all they need to do is just open or throttle the spigot. So we've gone from luxury to ultra luxury. I love to travel. I don't travel to cities or countries. I travel to hotels. I find hotels that look great, and that's where I go on vacation. And you have seen basically the Ritz-Carlton, the Four Seasons, which used to be sort of the top luxury brands, be bested. They were sort of for the top 3 or 4%, but now 0.1% brands have come in, because that's where a ton of incremental income has happened. So you're seeing hotels where the average price point is $7,000 or $9,000 a night, and they're full. So you used to have the Four Seasons, the Mandarin Oriental, and the Ritz-Carlton, and now you have Cheval and Blanc, Almond, Rosewood, Six Senses have all come in and said, no, the opportunity is in the 0.1%. So a weird prediction, but I'm obsessed with football. You're going to see a massive increase in the value of sports teams over the next 10 years, right? One, because as long as we're producing more and more billionaires who happen to be in the midst of a midlife crisis, you're going to see a massive increase in the value of these teams. And you're seeing it now. You're seeing an acceleration in the value of sports teams. One, they actually benefit from some secular trends, structural trends. They're the only content that doesn't look to be disrupted by, it's the only content we watch live now that advertising still works. And it also taps into people's emotions. You also have an entire region, the Gulf, that has decided, okay, we need to improve our image. We have to pivot to a non-fossil fuels-based economy. We have 30 to 50 years to do that. We have infinite capital. So how do we do that? How do we create a perception such that the most talented people in the world want to come work, live, and be educated here? We have to upgrade our image. There's a smart people, they figured out unlimited resources. So they used to advertise on Bloomberg and CNN and say, invest in Malaysia, Qatar, a great place to live. And what they figured out is if they buy a football team, they get some of that positive brand imagery. And they'll probably break even on a cash flow basis, maybe lose some money, and then in 10, 20, or 30 years, the asset has increased in terminal value. So this is the ultimate brand ROI expenditure if you're trying to upgrade the perception of a country. So we're going to start to see the Gulf nations come into every league, buy teams, because it's as if they could run a commercial, but then in 10 years, they get 3 times the cost of the commercial back. It's also a fantastic way to cross over celebrity, media, and the value of these things. I would imagine that Ryan Reynolds and Rob are probably going to make 5 to 10x on their investment just over 24 months on Wrexham. Little awkward being on his boat. Is the bottom line. Billionaire Republicans, as they realize they're not going to live forever, start buying football teams, and billionaire Democrats buy media companies. This is kind of the ultimate expression of, like, you haven't wrapped your head around death yet. I just like this slide. And I'm here to announce that at some point, if I have another 30 or 40 exits, I'm going to buy Rangers FC in Glasgow. I'm going to take my boys. I'm going to be really into the community, and they will love me. Okay. So the values of these sports teams is already accelerating. There's going to be investor groups, SPACs. This is going to be kind of the new accelerating luxury item. You're going to see all sorts of new investment opportunities. Someone enterprising will put together a DAO and start buying teams, and people like us will have the opportunity to participate. And then I think you're especially going to see it in football. Again, I'm biased here, but I think that this league or these teams appear to be global brands, or I think they're going to accelerate faster than any other global brands. You're going to start hearing terms like, Arsenal and Inter Milan that you didn't hear before, or that most people didn't hear before. These brands are going global. This is a shocker. I'm really going on a limb here. I said this a year ago. I have this kind of secret weapon for figuring out if a technology is enduring. And that is, I look at the amount of citations in academic journals. And typically what you have is in academia, the whole academic research is really, it's a wonderful thing. It sounds very basic, but it's really a wonderful thing. And that is, you publish something, you say, wow, I think I'm onto something about AI. And you publish it. And you publish your theses and your research. And then a colleague from Carnegie Mellon or Tulane says, this is what you got right and this is what you got wrong, and I'm going to refute it. And if they can refute it, we actually celebrate them as long as they add value to it. And we congratulate them. We don't start shit posting each other on Twitter. We say, okay, what you're saying is right, you've made my research better. And we have an enduring build of intellectual property that ideally then floats into the private sector. And as you can see in mobile and GPS, that build was slow and steady. And I would argue that mobile and GPS are probably the most enduring technology of the last 30 years. Now, in contrast, let's look at the academic research and citations of the metaverse and crypto, right? Me and my colleagues, oh, the metaverse is hot, right? Oh, crypto, it's hot, right? And then this is what happens. It just dies. Look at the curve on artificial intelligence. It's very similar to the curve of mobile and GPS. And I can't find any other technology that has the same citations or the same curve of this, the most enduring technology other than AI. So every academic journal entry has been improved upon. We've been thinking and talking and writing about this for a long time and researching it, and it continues to get better and better and better. And this, in my view, is in fact an enduring technology. Every year, I'm a glass half empty kind of guy. I'm better at predicting when technologies don't work. I have every year kind of the most ridiculous technology award. 2 years ago, it was the metaverse. Right? 40% of people who put on that headset feel nauseous within 30 minutes. No one wants to go into an incel panic room. These things, I think big tech is a net positive for the world. I do not believe that of Meta. And I could not have invented a better strategy than to convince a young man to spend $1.2 billion a month on his big gulp ayahuasca dreams that people are going to want to go into a legless universe and hang out with him and other people. I think we all have an obligation. If you, like me, think that people who run Meta are mendacious fucks, I think that you have an obligation to talk up the metaverse. Because my fear is they wake up from this consensual hallucination and start reducing the spend. So I think it has real potential. $5 days to 1 million users, right? The curve on adoption in AI is blowing away everything. We're in the fear-mongering part of the cycle. I'm actually quite optimistic about AI, which stands out, I think. And by the way, Tristan, who I adore and have a lot of respect for, is worried about this, and I purposely wanted to go to his talk yesterday to get insight into why he's worried about it. But what I see is that every new technology, it's easier to understand the downsides, right? We knew that automation was going to fire a lot of people on the factory floor, and it did in the short term. But we didn't anticipate heated seats or car stereos, and net employment in the automobile industry actually went up. And so, yeah, I think there's going to be some job destruction, and I think there'll be some security risks. But the amount of new businesses and opportunities by feeding your health records, your spending patterns, into these LLMs, you're going to come up with all sorts of new businesses and new ideas. Okay, let me skip this. Obviously, we hit kind of peak hype cycle. Everyone is talking about AI, right? It kind of reminds me of '99 when you just said WilliamSonoma.com and your stock price went up. And everyone's trying to figure out on the dark side here what industries it really destroys. So the Czech CEO made the mistake of saying that he felt some pressure from ChatGPT and the stock lost 40% of its value in 5 minutes in the aftermarket. So investor relations has really now become a story of spin. The number of journalists over the last 30 years has been cut in half. The number of corporate PR executives, the number of comms people at companies has gone up 6-fold. So the ratio of bullshit to journalism has gone the wrong way 12x. The reason why is that 3 out of 4 companies that went public 30 years ago were profitable, and we would assign a multiple within a fairly narrow range to get the valuation. Now 3 and 4 companies that go public are not profitable, or at least over the last 10 years, which means the narrative is more important than the numbers. So the core competence of every CEO is to be a great storyteller and capture people's imagination, pull cheap capital forward such that he or she can overinvest and run away from the competition. So as a result, the PR and comms people manicuring Zuckerberg's image at Facebook now outnumber the number of journalists at the Washington Post. Think about that. There's more people trying to kind of put wallpaper over these lies, the delay and obfuscation that is Meta, than there are journalists at the Washington Post. Typically, technologies either create a bunch of new winners or they accrete to the existing players, right? Search, social, e-commerce went to new players, mobile went to existing players. You would argue cloud kind of went to existing players. So far, it looks like the big bursts of market capitalization are going to existing players because it requires substantial infrastructure, specifically massive processing power. Coming back to travel, I think there's enormous opportunities in travel and AI. I'm going to the Euro finals with my 12-year-old, and we're playing with AI to try and create the ultimate weekend. But you can see how this would be a tremendous time savings. Again, going back to time machines to plan a great weekend. Give me a great weekend with 6 of my friends, all women in our 30s. We want to go to Mexico. This is our economic weight class. These are our priorities. And it comes back with an itinerary and then a series of questions. What else can I answer for you? Do you want me to make reservations? Confirm now. Do you want me to send emails out to the 6 friends? I mean, you can just see this is going to get really exciting very fast in travel. Okay. I had my first AI moment at LAX when I was coming in, and I went to global entry and I started putting my passport in, and I heard Galloway, and I'm a narcissist, so I immediately thought, oh, it's a fan. and it was a woman from TSA saying, you're good. And so they're doing facial recognition and layering on AI such that you can get right through the airport. I think that's fantastic. By the way, I'm all for privacy violation as long as we have strong courts and people to oversee or punish companies when they abuse that data. But the notion that any of you give a flying fuck about privacy is hilarious, as you'll tell everybody exactly what you're doing everywhere. With a thin layer of AI, if Uber gets hacked, we're going to know if you're having an affair, your HIV status, and if you terminated a pregnancy. It is going to be, you have given up all privacy. This is the industry that AI will disrupt. And it's because it's the most disruptible industry. The way to describe American healthcare is expensive but bad. It's outpaced inflation. It is now the largest industry in our economy, and only 20% of healthcare consumers are happy with their healthcare. Think about that. It's raised prices faster than inflation for 30 or 40 years, and only 1 in 5 consumers are happy with their healthcare. We spend $12,000 per person on healthcare. I mean, think about it. Australia spends less than 5. And yet we die much earlier. Think about that. Mostly through deaths of despair, opioid addiction, suicide, right? But think about just how ridiculous it is, and also obesity, but that we have a nation that spends a lot more than anyone else, and yet we're dying earlier. And again, terrible satisfaction. So again, it's more about how disruptible an industry is than the technology itself. And I think you're going to see, if I just was an economic animal, strong certification, some decent options professionally, and I thought, where is the most wind going to be in my sail? I would try and position myself somewhere between AI in healthcare, right? Where you feed in your workouts, your nutrition. Here are just my grocery bills. Here's my fitness app. Here's my Amex receipts. And here's my blood work. And I want this AI model to start managing my healthcare and making recommendations and take healthcare from a defensive, on your heels, disease-driven application to an offensive, health-driven. And I think there's going to be all sorts of costs. I don't have health insurance. And people hear that and they go, whoa, no health insurance. Because health insurance for me and my family, for the health insurance I want, is $50,000 a year. And because I have some economic security, I can absorb a big health scare. I could absorb almost any health scare. And so I decided, all right, about 50% of our healthcare costs are not being reimbursed, so I'm going to go without health insurance. I did that 5 years ago. $250,000 will buy a lot of healthcare. So what the healthcare industry has done, especially the health insurance, the insurance part of the industry, which I think is the most vulnerable, 45% of all insurance costs in healthcare go to profits and administration, meaning if you spend $100 on health insurance, you're getting $55 back. If you're a younger person, you don't get 55 bucks, you get more like 25 or 35 because you're subsidizing people my age and older. But we scare you. You're irresponsible. And what if you get really sick? So again, it's another example of a very elegant transfer of wealth from young people to old people, under the same auspices of rejectionism or a capital gains tax that rewards money more than sweat. Who makes money off money? People my age. Who makes money off sweat? People your age. Second biggest tax deduction in America, mortgage interest. Who owns homes? People my age. Who rents? People your age. People over the age of 70 are 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago. People under the age of 40 in America are 24% less wealthy. Almost everything we do in America is an elegant transfer of wealth from young people to old people. And we wonder why there's a birth dearth. Birth rates are off 20% in the last 5 years, and everyone's staring at their navel saying, why aren't young people having kids? It's because they can't afford them. Want to see that again? All right. We need a time machine in healthcare. Whoever builds it is going to make billions. Right now, it takes 2 hours for an in-person visit. A telehealth visit takes 13 to 15 minutes. This is an enormous unlock. The mother of a child with diabetes, and let's be honest, it's always the mom, spends 5 months of her year managing that child's healthcare. Think about that. You have a child with diabetes, between the referrals, the applications, the insurance, you spend 5 months of your year managing that child's healthcare. The pandemic did bring an acceleration in remote healthcare. Only about less than 3% of visits were remote. It went almost to 40% during the pandemic. It's come down, but it's still an enduring part of our healthcare system, remote visits. 38%. It's a huge unlock in mental health, right? This is especially dominant or is seen as a real innovation in the mental health sector. I think it's going to be big in fitness. I'm going to spend a lot of time there. I have 10 minutes. I'm going to cut to the end. I just thought it'd be fun to talk about space tourism, being on a Virgin boat. I think this is the most ridiculous business anywhere. Virgin Galactic was nothing but an elegant transfer of wealth from retail investors who wanted to participate in the FOMO tech economy such that Richard Branson could keep this ship operating during COVID. We spend more time, just got very awkward in here. We spent more time watching Jeff Bezos go up in a dildo than talking about climate change in 2022. When Bob from accounting gets immolated on the launch pad, this entire industry goes away. It is both supply constrained and demand constrained. There aren't that many people who want to spend $400,000 to go 3 times as high as you'll go on your way home. And not only that, space is really, really difficult. There's a reason they call it space. It doesn't want you there. It immediately begins destroying material and basically attacking any organism. It's a terrible business. Space exploration, another ridiculous business, ridiculous idea. And you got to hand it to them. The view on Mars will take your breath away. Literally, it'll take your breath away. You can't breathe there. This is the weather here. This is the weather on Mars. Also, if you're a responsible person, you should absolutely take up base jumping before you go into space. 550 people have gone into space, 11 have not come back. It has about 10 times the mortality rate of base jumping. It's a very dangerous business. The part of space that does make sense is space hauling, specifically SpaceX. We need to get more defense and communication equipment, and it's essentially who can get things up reliably and cheaply. I think SpaceX is going to be more valuable than Tesla, mostly because Tesla's value will implode. It's a car company, not a software and energy company. But SpaceX has figured out a way to get heavy materials into orbit much more cost effectively. Okay, I'm going to skip through this. Loneliness. My guess is you've heard a lot about this weekend. I'm working with Surgeon General Vivek Murthy, who's a very impressive and lovely man. But anytime you take one substance and transfer it or transition it to another, there's externalities. Anytime you take X and turn it into Y for economic gain, you're going to get externalities. We turn plant-based calories into beef-based calories, we get methane and deforestation. We take fossil fuels and we turn them into petroleum, and obviously we get externalities in the form of carbon. I do not believe that carbon emissions and climate change are the most serious threat facing humanity. I think there's another externality that has arisen because of a conversion of one substance to another that is a bigger threat. And that is the conversion from advertising into dollars, or specifically from attention into advertising into dollars. Because what we figured out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we thought it was sex that would keep you glued to your screen. But what we have found out is that the real sex that sells isn't sex, it's rage. And as a result, the companies that are now building the most shareholder value are the ones that basically are in the business of polarizing and dividing and depressing. And why do I think it's the most dangerous emission? If we all hate each other, we're never going to figure out a way to come to any sort of agreement or action plan around the other things that ail us, because we don't trust each other. The moment one group takes a position on something, there's reason for the other group to suspect them and gaslight them, or basically not believe it. It doesn't matter what it is. We used to be bipartisan around science, but I know the algorithms like it when I say mRNA vaccines alter your DNA. Oh, we like that. Elevate that content because it pisses people off. And we'll get more comments, more engagement, more enragement, more engagement, more Nissan ads. The result is depression. 1 in 3 teenage girls have contemplated suicide. 1 in 5 LGBTQ youth have attempted suicide. So I went back to my old high school, University High School in West Los Angeles a few weeks ago, 2,000 kids, assuming somewhere between 5 and 10% identify as LGBTQ. It's 200. That means 40 kids over the next 3 years are going to try and kill themselves. When I was in high school, we had a memorial almost every weekend, or every week. We'd come in, we'd go, oh no, we'd see a picture of somebody and a bunch of flowers. And it was from, almost always, it was from drunk driving. When I grew up, I lived in LA, there was no public transportation, huge alcohol abuse, no airbags, Mothers Against Drunk Driving really hadn't kicked in, and kids would take to Sunset Avenue totally fucked up and get in an accident with, no collapsible steering wheel shaft or airbags, and we had death all the time. Now it's no longer drunkenness, or cars, it's depression. The fear I do have around AI is that I worry that young people are entering into a series of low-risk, low-payoff relationships. I'm going to convince myself I'm learning and that I'm investing, and I'm going to go on Coinbase. I'm going to convince myself I'm politically engaged by going on Twitter. I'm going to convince myself I have friends, but I'm not really experiencing friendship. And I think slowly but surely, especially young men who have very few mating opportunities because online dating is kind of consolidated mating, where the top 5% of males get 80% of the opportunities. They're going to engage in a low risk, easy, low barrier relationships with sex bots and AI trained girlfriends. And I think this ultimately over time makes us depressed, that the reason we're happy, the reason we're joyous is we engage in victory. We have obstacles that make the destination or the relationship more rewarding. There's a reason the romantic comedies are 2 hours, not 10 minutes. Supposedly there's new research showing if you smoked and had friends, right, or didn't smoke and had no friends, you would live longer if you smoked a pack a day and had friends. And now 1 in 7 males don't have a single friend. I mean, think about that. Think about the amount of joy, think about the prosperity, just the sense of self-worth, the laughter you've experienced with friends, and 1 in 7 males in America doesn't have a single friend. I'm not going to play the clip on her. So I'm worried that slowly but surely we're going to start to replace human touch and what it means to be a mammal and decide that, trying to meet people is hard. Having the confidence to approach someone and express romantic relationship while making them feel safe is a skill that young men aren't establishing. And so they'll turn to AI. And slowly but surely they'll sequester themselves from the rest of the world, which I think leads to depression. There's a woman who's now turned herself into a scalable girlfriend, and she expects to make $5 million this month, charging $1 a minute. I love this quote, right? It kind of summarizes it all. What is love if it's not grief persevering? Most of my philosophy I get from Disney+. Okay, this is my last thing. I'm a bit of a downer, so I always try to end with some up note. If you look at our catastrophizing and how down we become about the world and how bad things become, a lot of it is the cadence of the news cycle. News used to be 22 minutes once a day. Then it turned into 20 hours. And now that it's every 20 seconds on your phone with notifications, the only way to keep you on your screen is to catastrophize, right? Things marginally better today is not a good headline. That doesn't work, right? So we have to create a situation for the situation room. So we constantly catastrophize and make ourselves feel worse about the world and each other. So if you looked and if you just took the perspective back and said, all right, last year, here's were the biggest headlines. Any headline you get every 20 seconds is usually not a good headline. But what if you went back 5 years? Still kind of bad. Can anyone hear that, or am I having a stroke? Is there like a rumbling? Thanks for that. If you went back 50 years, if you went 1, 5, 10, the news, if you had to pick headlines, the news gets progressively better the more perspective you have. Perspective is a photographic term. And the more you create the angle wider, the better the news gets. Because the reality is, if you're honest with yourself and you look at anything from a long-term perspective, the news just gets hard to deny it's pretty good. What would the news be if you had one headline for the last 50 years? Probably be unprecedented prosperity led by China and the US. Or that abject poverty has been cut by 80%. If you could only pick 1 or 2 headlines, you'd have no choice but probably to make them positive. And if you could only have 1 headline for the last 100 years, what would it be? That's a very good one. Life expectancy in China since the year I was born has gone from 46 to now 76. And 500 million people have been brought out of poverty in China over the last 30 years. But still, I think that probably the headline for the last 100 years would be that the West turned back fascism, which is a great headline. So as the cadence of news has increased, our sentiment has gone further and further down. And we need some means of self-correcting around all this negativity. Okay, I'm not going to talk about how great it is to be an American. I think a lot about regrets and time and how fast it's barreling. The majority of our existence as a species, we didn't live past 34. For about 99.9% of our time as Homo sapiens, we lived to be about 30 or 34. We died in childbirth, died in war or conflict, a broken bone or a bad cut meant death. So our brains literally can't process us past the age of 35 or 40. By the way, by the time you hit 38, you have trouble adapting to the way you look after that. Every day you look in the mirror, you're like, shit, because you can't process it, because you're not supposed to be here. In addition, you can't get your mind around time. And ask anyone in this audience over the age of 40, time literally begins to fall off a cliff. Years become seasons. And I'm fascinated with what are the biggest regrets at the end of your life. My colleague Adam Alter has done great work on this, and I only got another minute or so here. And he spends a lot of time with people at the end in palliative care. And their regrets basically boil down to three things. I wish I'd lived the life I wanted to live, not the life that others wanted me to live. I wish I'd stayed in touch with friends. And most importantly, I wish I'd been less hard on myself. I wish I'd forgiven myself. I think about this a lot as I'm barreling towards the end. I'm an atheist. I think at some point I'll look into my kids' eyes and know that our relationship is coming to an end, and I find it a source of power. But if you're successful, you live a lot in the past. You call on your credentials and your experience to try and inform your current actions. And if you're like me and you suffer from depression and anger, you spend the majority of your waking hours in the past. God, I can't believe what a fucking idiot I am. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I said that. You're constantly beating yourself up, right? Can't get past this immutable thing called the past. You just can't get past it. And if you're successful, also I'll say like me, you're a lot in the future. You're constantly trading off the short term. You're constantly planning. I got on this boat yesterday because I was supposed to speak at 3:30. I don't like boats. I've never been on one before. I'm agoraphobic. I don't like people much. And so when I saw the boat was still docked, I thought, I'm going to do this talk and bomb to Miami Airport, get home, and I was already planning the Tottenham Spurs Brentford game with my sons and what I was going to do with my free time. I was already in the future, planning how to be more productive. And chances are, if I'd made that football game, I would have been on my phone virtue signaling that I was with my son, checking the amount of likes I got, thinking about what I was going to do the next day. Never really there, right? Never, always in the future, always in the past, never really there. And I like what Sam Harris says. The past is the most immutable thing in the world. The future is the most mutable thing. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of control over it. But this is it. This is it. This is the only thing we have is the here and the now. And my biggest fear, and I think about this a lot, is that I'll be at the end and I'll look back and I'll go, oh my God, unbelievable blessings. Staggering prosperity that I didn't expect. People I love and that love me immensely, right? But I was never really there for it. Did my life happen? So I leave us with a question. And it's something I ask myself all the time now. Are you here? That's all I got.